Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Catherine Sievett, Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture here at the Weitzman School of Design, and I'm very happy to welcome you here at the Kleinman Center, Kleinman Forum here for the third of our department's Fall 2023 Now Landscape Lecture Series. I'd like to begin with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the University of Pennsylvania is situated upon the ancestral homeland and territory of the Lenni Lenape peoples. As members of an educational community, we are obligated to know the histories of dispossession that have allowed the University of Pennsylvania to grow and thrive on this vibrant terrain. As designers and thinkers, we endeavor to build in ways that lead toward justice, and we are committed to working to dismantle the ongoing consequences of settler colonialism. So, as many of you know, this fall's Now Landscape Lecture Series has been curated by our very own Sean Burkholder, who serves as the Andrew Gordon Assistant Professor of Landscape Architecture. Sean, along with Brian Davis of the University of Virginia, is also the co-founder of the Research and Design Practice Proof Project, which on Saturday received a 2023 American Society of Landscape Architects Professional Award in the research category for their project entitled The Cobble Bell. Yay! The title of the project is Cobble Bell, Research Through Geology Inspired Coastal Management. Congratulations. It was amazing to see Sean walk across that big stage and receive that honor. And our amazing guest this evening, Ron Henderson, is a Weitzman dual degree landscape architecture and architecture alumnus, class of 1995. And a professor of landscape architecture and the former director of the Landscape Architecture and Urbanism program at the Illinois Institute of Technology. And the stars align. Ron also received a 2023 ASLA Honor Award in the communications category for his Sakura Orihan, a display at the United States National Arboretum that is composed of 15 Orihan or folding books. The set of sketchbooks on display at the National Arboretum record Ron's pilgrimages as part of his Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission Fellowship in 2012. Ron's Sakura Orihon sketchbooks are beautiful visual journeys that literally draw the poetry of the landscape, its vegetal and mineral elements. Ron's many, many sketchbooks are on display here in the room, and he invites you to take a look across the course of the evening. The traveling collection that just appeared out of his suitcase about an hour ago includes his very first sketchbook from 1994, which was part of his sketches from a study abroad semester in Japan, which included a visit to the amazing Issei Shrine. See if you can find out which one that is. Meanwhile, Ron will be also sharing his tree talk with us tonight. We're so happy to welcome you back to Penn. And I'd like to now welcome Sean Burkholder to the floor to introduce you to our community. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back once again to our Fall Landscape Lecture Series. I'm really excited to introduce Ron Henderson to you all. Ron is a good friend of mine before his job at Illinois Institute of Technology. Ron was department head at Penn State University, where he was my director at that point in time, and we grew quite close at that point. Ron's also held positions at Harvard, the Rhode Island Institute of Design or School of Design, and also Tsinghua University in Beijing, China. He's a senior fellow of garden and landscape studies at Dunbarton Oaks and has held more fellowships and received more awards than I have time to get into at the moment. So his academic work, at least to me, appears kind of split between what has become a very well-funded set of forays with his IIT colleagues into the subject of autonomous transport and its implications on the urban environment on one side, and then on the other side, this carefully curated set of explorations into our botanic world. And while I like the idea of sleeping on my drive to work as much as the next guy, I'm very excited today that we're talking about plants. I imagine that it is, with all the pressing conditions of climate change and social injustice, tends to force our moral hands towards reactive work that forefronts these issues. The ideas of stepping back and looking at something as simple as trees seems luxurious and perhaps even a bit unnecessary. However, it does us well to remember that our entangled relationships with the botanic creatures of this world are one of our attributes that make us and our discipline rich and unique. And it is through these relationships that we may be able to more creatively and productively respond to the challenges of the day. His forthcoming book, entitled 30 Trees, coming out by Birkhauser Press in a month, collects the perspectives of 30 landscape designers and their attitudes towards one particular species of tree. As a text, it shakes us back into awareness. It reminds us that trees remain one of our most productive collaborators. In a recent discussion with Ron, he told me about the word komorebi, the Japanese term used to describe the texture of shadows as they are cast by the leaves of trees. Yes, there's an actual word for this. And yes, of course, Ron knows the word. That feeling of light flittering over your face as you stand under a gladicia is so good that it's too good to not have a word for it, even if gladicia was not what inspired it. This past weekend in Minnesota, I was lucky enough to be around during what Karen and I call Ginkgo Day. It's the one day a year when it gets cold enough where all the ginkgo leaves drop, or all the ginkgo trees drop all their leaves in less than 24 hours. So you can stand underneath a tree and literally get rained on by leaves. You can also, for a short time, see the streets that are all lined with these perfect circles of bright yellow leaves. By mid-afternoon, the whole neighborhood was out raking leaves and talking, thankful that this only happens once a year, and cramming all of their fall lawn work into one October afternoon. Thank you very much, Ginkgo biloba, for letting that happen. Like many of us, I'm often scrambling to address all the pressing things, and sometimes I forget just how special trees can be. And it takes a word like komorebi or pulling the pile of ginkgo leaves out of my hair to remind me about how great trees are. So I'm excited that tonight's talk will serve as another kind of reminder of the value of trees and the highly formative actors that they are in our landscapes. So with that, please help me introduce Ron Henderson. Okay. Just this button. That's all you need. Just push that.
Thank you, Sean. Oh, I don't have to hold that. I got mine attached. So the last time I was in this space, I was in a studio with Laurie Olin and David Leatherbarrow. And this is a remarkable building. And so I'm so happy to be able to be here. A lot of friends, new and old. It's really great to be welcome back to Penn. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Sean. Tree Talk. There were more complicated names. In the end, it was just like, let's just talk about trees. My office is LIRIO. To date, we've planted or contributed to planting around 900,000 trees on the variety of projects that we've been able to work on. One tree. Send one tree to a row. Two trees. Then those you have MLA. A grid. Quincunx. And then you have like woods and forests. If we look at some projects in history, or if we're working, on our own work, we'll often discover that really our work can be typified by these simple tree planting types. So we can just demonstrate this with a very well-known example of the Miller Garden. In Columbus, Indiana, Dan Kiley, two trees, actually two single trees, Weeping Beech and a Magnolia Soulangeana that marked the entry. The Magnolia was destroyed in a storm about 18 months ago, is being replanted. You remember We extend one tree to a line. We have a series of lines as well, including the oaks in the front yard between Washington Street and the house, and the line of maple trees that lead from the alley and the house down to the river. Two trees. Magnolias again. So there's one magnolia at the front door and two magnolias at the other doors. And LAs. Of course, the horse chestnuts that line the drive are now Ohio Buckeyes. And of course, the Gladitsia honey locust LA that runs parallel to the bank and through which you would look from the house. Very iconic alley of honey locust, 20 feet on center, 15 feet on center in the other direction. So within these types, there's immense differentiation because of the species that you select, the spacing that you select, and the configuration. And if we look at Kylie's planting plan, we can see the clear articulation of all of those. Grids, both the apple orchard with its puddle, square puddle of light on the right. There's no quincunx here, but down the street at the North Christian Church, there is. Again, Magnolia Soulangeana. The geometry derived from the six-sided church of Eros Saarinen. And then we have a woods. The path to which has changed from the original proposal, which was a series of 3 sycamores marching down in enfilade to a pleasure garden with a space at the bottom left, the square, flooded plains and islands that were never built. This spring, we were able to take students from IIT there, and we were able to get down to this woodland in a beautiful spring day with an incredibly rich texture of ground cover and red buds. Feel pretty lucky to be there. Not everyone gets to go down to the woods. So as Sean mentioned, coming out soon is book 30 Trees, published by Burkhauser. The printer's press proof arrived today, so it's imminent. You can see a few familiar names there, Sean, and Lori, and a few others. And in it, I kind of talk about this tree type at the Miller Garden. Other projects, simpler projects, right? The Terry Harkness in the Midwest. We have one trees gathering around the house in the center, series of lines leading from the fields to the core of the farm, an orchard, grid, and clumps of kind of linear forests and woods. Together, create a planting milieu. My work at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum about 10 years ago was looking at how to maintain transparency from the street into the living room of the new addition. I have a series of diagrams, spring and summer at the top, fall in the bottom. We inherited a line of ginkgos that turned yellow, line of Gladitsia along the Evans Way, and then in the middle, a series of kind of runaway sugar maples and magnolias. The historic entry to the museum was between the yellow room and the blue room. And part of the reason why they really needed to build the addition is because essentially people would be taking off their coats and stomping off the snow off their boots in proximity to these wonderful rooms. So in the new edition, we did a kind of botanical exploration of how to keep yellow and blue present at the front door. There aren't a lot of blue plants, but Scylla is pretty amazing. And if the witch hazel blossoms hang on long enough in the winter, they do correspond. So we could get the yellow fronds of the witch hazel with the Scylla. Connecting the museum to the addition is a glass corridor. We learned after it was built that there's not enough time for the pupils of one's eyes to reduce from the brightness of the addition to the darkness of the historic museum. So we've been working, there was fritted surfaces put on the ceiling of the glass corridor, and then we were asked to pack that corridor with a kind of microforest so that your eyes would have a little bit more time to adjust. So when you first encountered the magnificent courtyard, your eyes still weren't too used to light. So densely textured enclosure of the canopy. We did a kind of family portrait of magnolias. So we have the Magnolia liliiflora, the Magnolia denudata, and their offspring, the Magnolia sourangiana. So we planted one of each of the parents and three of the kids kind of running around in the garden. Those of you who know the work of Renzo Piano would also recognize kind of the intensely finely detailed texture of his work at this particular period. So we also were seeking to find species with a kind of small, white, delicate flower and finely textured leaves. So we have, styrax and shad, and so you can see then the texture of the landscape is consistent with the fine texture of the light and the detailing of the addition. And lastly, we kind of lined the sidewalk with a thick line, which we studied quite a bit. And we ended up with styrax and amelanchier. So along the sidewalk march these single stem styrax japonica. And then in between them are kind of groups of three multi-stem amelanchiers that march along behind them. And so it kind of makes a thick line of finely textured white flowering species. One tree. The tree of life and abundance, Abel Rodriguez, the indigenous Amazonian painter who was displaced by violence from his homeland and settled in Bogota, where he paints his memory of the forest. He was the keeper of plant knowledge for his tribe, a position that he was identified as a child to hold, and he learned from his uncle. And the tree of life of an abundance tells us that the tree of life, the one you see, as he wrote, I never saw it, nor did I have it, even in my dreams. So how will I draw it? I had to invent it, so it has all the knowledge, thought, and power of humankind. The tree is edible fruit, trunk, leaves, branches, everything, according to the creator of the earth, our parents and our grandparents. It was the first and the last. It was air, it was water, it was fire, and it was lightning. It's everything that exists. Down there, ginkgo tree in Kyoto. Trees eating architecture. This is like my career and my life. In 2012, as Catherine mentioned, I received the Japan-US Friendship Commission Creative Artist Fellowship. I was the first landscape architect to get this fellowship. It was a fellowship that was established during the Jimmy Carter administration when they were negotiating a new military treaty between the US and Japan. And Jacob Javits, senator from New York, insisted that there be a rider on that defense appropriation, that we would also be exchanging culture. And so how many ever years, 21 plus 12 is 33 years later. That was the bill that gave me the ability to spend 4 months traveling in Japan, exploring the cherry blossom culture, horticulture, and kind of the performance and the events, the ritual events. This is Miharu Takizakura. 600,000 people visit this tree every year in about a month. It has a special resonance in Japan now as well, because it's only about 50 kilometers or so from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. That was a March 11th event. The cherry tree bloomed a few weeks later. It was one of the first signs that of normalcy in that region. I'm going to go back. So the tree is kind of like a Bernini sculpture, right? There's sitting there in 3 dimensions, and they've constructed this path that circumambulates. And so if you arrive, you go counterclockwise. You're at a particular distance away from the tree so that you can see its kind of full extents. Along the ridge in the back, just behind the tree, you can see a little grove. Those are all clones of this tree that are there in case something ever happens with this one, that they have a genetic seed bank. And so it's a designed landscape around this, 1,500-year-old tree. In my class at IIT, I teach plants and design. I invite our students to explore and design a tree monument, kind of one tree project, which is then followed by a 1,000 tree project. This is a good one tree project. A small shrine. It's on an easterly slope, which is well ventilated, right? Cherry trees don't like dampness. You can see that slope. Ususumi Zakura is another one of the 3 great cherry trees of Japan. Ususumi means pale India ink color. A lot of people come to visit this one every year too. The JR railways make a lot of money with moving people around Japan to look at cherry blossoms. This sketchbook is back in the back. Of all of the sketchbooks that I did 15 sketchbooks during that fellowship. This was the only one that I did in one day, like the whole thing one day, and that was on the trip out there. And so it documents that train ride, all the stations along the way. I thought I was going to see one cherry tree, but what I realized is I was going through a cherry tree landscape. There were cherry trees lining the rice fields. There were Yamazakura mountain cherry trees up in the mountains. And then at the little stations along the way, cherry trees have been planted so that when this little pink train that you'll see here in a minute came trundling through. This is one of the first photographs I took upon arrival, and I've actually walked behind the tree. Let's see. And that's what the blossoms were when I left at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So it was literally like popcorn, it was like you could almost hear the blossoms opening that day. A kind of remarkable day to be there. I mean, can you imagine, starting with that, not really being aware, and then coming and leaving with that. Sketching and documenting the number of supports and crutches and braces and yukitsuri being rope tents that hold up branches so that they don't break. Here's a sketch from Ogaki Station out on the Terumi-sen out to Terumi. This is the little pink train with cherry blossoms painted on it. And like I said, as you're traveling through these cherry blossom landscapes. So here you can see it's a very narrow gauge train, 2 cars. If you look closely, there's about $300,000 worth of Nikon cameras down at the end of the track, waiting for our little pink train to come trundling through the cherry blossoms. The blossoming was late that year. They had to mark out April 15th and move it back a week to the 22nd. And again, there are busloads and busloads of people arriving. Now you'll probably see here, and wondering what's happening in the background because the forest has been removed. So 2 things. One, you can see that the cypress trunks look like they'll be pretty good to help hold up all of those branches on that legacy tree. But also the forest was kind of impinging on the ventilation of the tree. So they cut the forest back to make sure that there's enough air movement. It's like the thinnest leaves, this kind of gray cast to the pink. I almost think it's just the shadow of the light coming on the other side of the blossom. This guy here is a dentist. He's also a cherry blossom expert. This tree almost died in the middle part of the 20th century. And Dr. Maeda excavated and root grafted to restore the tree. So they removed a stone wall that was around the tree, excavated, took viable rootstock and grafted them onto the roots of the tree. How many trees do you see there? I hate to tell Lori. There's 2. There's the one you can see with all the supports in the foreground, but in the background, just like at Miharu Takizakura, there's been a second one planted. So this is another landscape trick, right? The 17th, 18th, 19th century British landscape architects, they knew that, right? You'd plant clumps. So the amplifying of the scale by planting this other one kind of subservient to the primary one in the background amplifies the scale. 1 tree. A lot of the work that I've been doing recently with a master gardener from Japan is working on conserving legacy trees using these support systems that you see here. Here's a pine tree, the Kawasaki pine. This is since in severe decline. But nearby in Kanazawa at Kenrakuen Garden, they're cultivating one new Kawasaki pine that's been cultivated now for several hundred years. How do you design with 1 tree? Well, one is just it's the anomaly. This is Ritsuren Park in Takamatsu, where the park is famous for its black pines. There are thousands of black pines. And sitting there in the middle is this one cherry tree that in the spring decides that it's going to steal the show. There's a sketch of it. It's planted in a little crease between 2 landforms. It's being trained to draw out over that small little crease, which then leads to the lake. So that in the spring, when the blossoms fall, they accumulate in this little line, this little pink stream that winds down to the lake. And when the lake rises in the spring, it catches the blossoms and carries them out to the lake. A fig tree courtyard. This is the residence of Andrew Todd and Bridget O'Rourke. Andrew is a M.Arch graduate here, now living in France. Collaborated with him on this small courtyard. One fig tree, productive, shady, tall enough that you can walk under it without bumping your head. 2 trees. 2 Zelkova framing the entrance to the Chanlongting garden in Suzhou. 2 trees, same species, different habits. Oops. 2 trees, kind of crown shyness and joining together, shaped by the wind. At Crabtree Farm, north of Chicago, we get 2 trees enclosed by a fence to keep the cows away. And another pair along the road, the lane as you travel in. This kind of notion of the kind of parallax, right? As you move, those 2 trees change in relationship to the movement. We work with, as I said, with Korato Fujimoto, a Japanese master gardener from Kanazawa, on conservation of 2 legacy cherry trees at the United States National Arboretum. These are those 2, Ito Zakura, planted by Fairchild in the 1950s. So they're maybe 70, 80-year-old cherry trees that have been in decline. Jonathan Cavalier from Dumbarton Oaks is on the left. Korato, you can tell by his jacket. And we documented and prepared and installed a series of hose-away. Hose-away are the crutches, and hose-away means when you put your arm on your chin and you hold it up like this. This sketchbook is back there. And then this was May of this year, the day after we completed. Again, the Blossoms just decided that they were going to celebrate. So we're going to be monitoring this work through a series of research grants, looking to see how this will work to rejuvenate these legacy cherry trees. The North American model for rejuvenation is often retrenchment, which is to cut limbs back and bring the energy to the core. The Japanese model is the exact opposite, and the arborists at the Arboretum are really suspect about this. But the idea is that by supporting here, the energy is able to bypass, and you restore the tree by producing more biomass that collects the sun's energy and brings it back to the core. So it's an entirely different kind of spatial strategy for rejuvenation. Rhode. Photographs from Anne Spurn, who found that, you know, the problem with a row is what happens when a tree dies. Well, for Anne, it was just the window to see the poplars in the distance. Same species, of course, right? Plane trees. What's remarkable for me in this photograph is not only that kind of window to the distance, but that raking diagonal branches that have been kept in a few of these trees. Outside of Beijing, Kubla Khan said, plant trees at 3 meters on center so that we can find our way through the snow. You won't get lost here, and you won't fall down the mountain. Of course, it's hard to talk about a line without talking about Paul Klee, taking a line for a walk, enclosing space. You know, I've always thought this would make an amazing garden. But you can see 1 tree, 2 trees, 3 trees. You can see a grid. You can see hedges. Someday. And of course, lines are also windbreaks here in the south of Australia. Simple projects too. This is a project of Steve Stimson's outside Boston, where there's a tilia, one tree in the kind of arrival courtyard, a row of sugar maples along the lane, and a crabapple orchard. Do 3 trees make a row? This is the philosophical question. You know, we all have projects that we wish we had designed. This is one of them for me. A memorial for three men who were killed in a plane crash. A berm encloses a precinct planted with a line of trees very, very tightly together. A series of kind of prefabricated stone pieces enclosing an inner precinct that has a marker and 3 trees, one for each of the gentlemen. These are powerful. And from a distance. LA to go. You know, so the king could ride his horses without bumping his heads through the woods. But you'll see here that forest has also been trimmed out with a new planting of trees in a straight line along the edge. Again, in the book, Antonio Longo from Milan writes about the black locust of all things. The Italians wrote about American trees, the Chileans wrote about the European trees, the Brit wrote about an American tree, like this, not what I expected. But if you look closely to the plan, there's a primary axis running top to bottom. And this is a restored estate. And there's a little bit of red going crosswise, and that's the younger planted LAs. And then the old LA heading out into the horizon. Of course, the MLA at Central Park. Central Park's big, and there's stuff in the middle. And if you're at the edge, how do you get to the middle? Because you may just stay at the edge. So you put a line of trees that just, you know, go there. LA. Get from the corner and come to the middle. "35 feet-ish. It's hard to measure when the trees are all wiggly. And then grids and quincunx. Trees are food. So we have grids and quincunx are often horticultural or orchard or food production types. This is Yunnan in China, where each apple is given a microclimate with a red wrapper. Kind of slingshot peach trees, also north of Beijing. Huda Jiaofeng, the tall tree, catches the wind. So you trim the orchard so you can pick the fruit. These need to be pruned. Komorebi, Sean, a word that I learned from Toru Mutani, who in the book writes about the Katsura tree. And here at Shinagawa Station in Tokyo planted hundreds of Katsura in a grid, filling up the space of this enormous transportation center. You know, the great lunettes that we know well. Here's Bovely Garden. Let's zoom in there a little bit. And there we've got a grid and we've got a quincunx. So again, when I said earlier that we can kind of assemble understandings of gardens and their kind of organization, something as complex as Bobley Garden, which has topography and dozens and dozens of kind of squares like tipping all over the land. When you look closely, there's a series of very clear planting typologies in a kind of checkerboard. They kind of blur together in their overgrown state. Osk can also be a small urban setting, Paley Park, of course, with I'm particularly fond of the three that escaped out onto the sidewalk. In next month, our spring park in Newport, Rhode Island will open. The Colony House, the original government center for Rhode Island, is there on the right. The first Jewish synagogue in America is about 200 feet to the left. The Quaker Meeting House is about 600 feet down the hill. It looks kind of like this now. A more recent kind of update of a sketch, a grid of 9 mussel woods, a line of 3 mussel woods, and then another line of 3 at a slightly different angle to reconcile all kinds of geometries. So together we get 9 plus 6 equals 15 mussel woods, which are then anchored at the corner by 2 larger elms and a big hackberry. Forests and woodlands. Gunther Vogt, surprise, wrote about birches. Those of you who know his work are not surprised that he wrote about birches. What you don't know is what he wrote, because he talks about as an 8-year-old boy being sent by his mom to go with his dad to pick out a Christmas tree and cut it down out of the woods. And Gunther told his dad, I want that tree. It was a birch, not an evergreen. And his dad's like, well, I don't know what your mom's going to think about that. But they brought it home, and it was their Christmas tree. So what's really kind of remarkable to me about this book is the personal stories that people have been able to convey. It's actually a really personal book of people telling tree stories. How small can a forest be? We might call these copses. Freeform, it's crazy. And inside of that, it's like it's a vault. It's like being in that crazy thing they just built in Las Vegas. Project just down the street by some people here in the room and here rattling around a good old pen, a kind of series of kind of forest circles. And we're back to Abel Rodriguez, who not only painted one tree, but also would paint the forest. This is Abel. I learned about the forest the hard way. I had to be awake for long hours at night. I had to lend my ears to the elders and make special diets. Our learning was a spiritual process. That's why we consider knowledge as very valuable. Elevations, plans, we know these, right? So can we make small forests? This is the good version of the MoMA garden, if I might say so. Just left to right, 5 trees, 2 trees, 3 trees, 3 trees in the middle, 1 tree, 3 trees, 5 trees. And when you aggregate them, they become a grove. divides the space, shapes the space. In collaboration with Krzysztof Legiczko and Julian Bonder, we won an international competition for the expansion of B.Arch Park in Denver. For a lot of reasons, the full project was not fully accomplished, but our colleagues, Mundus Bishop in Denver, were able to do primarily a lot of the restoration of the grassland and restoration of some of the initial work that was from Halprin's office. This is a grove of Tilia. And our proposal was to take the ravine, and those of you who know the story of Babi Yar was a site in the Ukraine where about 300,000 Jewish were executed and kind of herded into this ravine and shot and then covered with the soil from which they had been kind of working for the life of their families. And so we, working with Krzysztof Legiczko, we did a kind of living memorial. This is an empty vessel, articulation along the ravine, and then arriving at a repository or kind of library that would trace victims of terrorism. Not built. Just back from Japan a couple weeks ago, and was able to revisit one of my favorite landscapes in the world, which is the forecourt between Marunouchi and the Imperial Palace. This field of black pines on the left, which kind of segues into a mixed black pine and mixed deciduous forest closer to the city. Hundreds of the same species, each identifiable as an individual. Akiomi writes about these trees in the book. And of course, I have a sketchbook of them. Kind of going back for a couple of days, just sitting there and picking one and drawing it and picking another. One tree, row. Two trees, LA, grid, quincunx, forest. This was the order of human institutions. Gian Battista Vico. First the forests, after that the huts, then the villages, next the cities, and finally the academies. Thank you, David Leatherbarrow. This is where I learned this book. One of my favorite books, Forest, the Shadow of Civilization by Robert Pogue Harrison. Talks about first the forest, the shadows of law, enlightenment, force of nostalgia, and dwelling. He's a professor of Italian literature. And so this is the vision of forests through the lens of Italian literature. And nothing disquiets the rationalist, he said, more than a forest. In many languages. 2 projects left. Not bad ones, right? The Bois de Boulogne. Dagobert. I just like saying the name, Dagobert. Was known to hunt. 100 Years' War. Burned, replanted, royal residence, mulberry trees in the late 1500s, when Europe finally figured out the secret recipe for silk. 40,000 British and Russian troops were in the Bois de Boulogne following the defeat of Napoleon. As you can imagine, not much of the tree canopy left. And then, 175 years ago, Paris had a series of parks, but not these 2. Napoleon III was exiled in London, saw Hyde Park, and saw that really we needed to do something like that. And Alphonse and Haussmann made it happen. It influenced many other parks. If you're a good enough landscape architect, you can have a monument built for yourself. But in order to do this, a whole economy and construction process and production of trees had to be invented because they were planting 400,000 trees. So you not only have to invent and design the park, but you also had to design equipment and process. And within a couple decades, people like Van Gogh were out there planting, painting newly planted trees that still have their tree guards around them. And it's an incredible asset to the city. And then the last is the Olympic Forest Park, a project that I was an advisor to Rhode and the Tsinghua Urban Planning and Design Institute during the time I was teaching at Beijing. For me, this is one of the most remarkable maps of a city that I've ever seen. The grid, you can see that's Beijing as we kind of know it, and the Imperial Palace is sort of right in the middle of that. And the Yongding River comes out of the mountains to the north and the west. As it comes out into the mountains, into the alluvial plain, over the last 30,000 years, it's taken many different routes. The current route is the one that almost goes straight down into the bottom left corner. The thick one that goes up, you'll see where kind of in the middle is where the Olympic Forest Park is going to be. But on the carcass of all these other streams are all of the public parks of Beijing. Almost without fail, they're all on the carcass of the former riverbeds because there's a little bit of water, or at least a little bit of soil that has the right kind of water, right kind of characteristics to hold water. So the Summer Palace, this is the Summer Palace. Yuanming Yuan is right here. Sichuhai is here. There's the Forbidden City. And the Olympic Forest Park gets built up here on touching on this northernmost one. I teach a course called The Natural History of Cities. This is the first slide I show. How the persistence of 30,000 years of hydrology and geology, I know I'm speaking like a Penn grad now. 30,000 years of hydrology and geology continue to impact the civic spaces of one of the world's great cities. Olympic Forest Park. It's also on the primary north-south axis. Yep. Not a lot of trees, but they saved them. Here's me on the left, Hu Jie and Colin Franklin. This was about 14 months before the park opened. Tree team. Renders, and reality, right? It was one of the first parks in Beijing, actually in China, to have a phytoremediation. Over 500,000 trees were planted in less than 2 years. So that's 2 years after those dusty photographs. 1 tree, well, 2 tree, LA. Grid, Quinconx Woods. Thank you. 350 slides, 47 minutes.
Yes. So if you would like to ask any questions, we'll take a couple of minutes and then we might keep questions short because there are lots of great things to see in the back of the room and we could leave a little bit of time for that, but I'm going to bring a mic to you if you have a question. This mic.
It's the nearby garden of circles.
It's at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. It's the Central Green.
Ben?
Where's Trevor?
I mean, I guess you can.
There's Trevor.
Yeah.
Hi, yeah, I'm Ben. Just
Ben.
first, I want to thank you again for coming today. And also, I actually did get the pleasure of seeing the exhibit at the National Arboretum during the
Amazing.
Magnolia Bloom. So it was really cool getting to see it. But one thing I was curious about there is, and happy that talking about it, is the propping structures for a lot of these cherry blossoms. And being someone who's previously lived in DC, seeing that now as a lot of the cherry blossoms are starting to age out and starting to have issues, especially not just more historic trees in the Arboretum on the mall, but elsewhere in the city, like for these trees that are in rows in LAs that are like maybe in less significant portions, what steps could be done to try to do more restoration work, kind of similar to what's happened with the more historic singular trees?
So I collaborate again with Kurato Fujimoto, who's a master gardener from Kanazawa. He's been to DC 4 times together. And every time he's like, I need to stay here and take care of all the cherry trees. They need to be pruned. Although there's a saying in Japanese, Sakura kirubaka, ume kiranubaka. It's a fool who prunes a cherry tree, and it's a fool who does not prune a plum tree, right? Because plum trees are very hard-wooded and you can cut them and they do great. Cherry trees, of course, if you cut them, you're exposing soft wood to moisture. But anyway, he would say they definitely need to be, just having routine maintenance would help. That would remove some branches. If they're disfigured or they're already damaged, then hose away would also help rejuvenate them as well. The ones around the tidal basin are a complex condition because they're all being flooded from the Potomac, and that's saline water. And so the soil is becoming saline, and that's not gonna, like, there's no pruning, propping you can do to keep that from persisting. Yeah, it's gonna be an issue. So like, let's figure out how to get Kurato to live in America. And as he said, he spent 10 years as an apprentice to know how to do this and build yukitsuri and prune maple trees. He wants an apprenticeship program. Like, he wants to be able to help people who are interested build careers around taking care of trees.
I was really struck by the one tree genetic clone idea. And I was curious about relationships between trees and the propping structures. In the examples you showed, do you know the type of wood or tree that produced the crutches? And I was curious, what was the type of tree or wood that produced the crutches at the U.S. Arboretum? It looked like white, almost like it was a birch.
Yes, the favored species in Japan is the Hiba arborvitae. At the U.S. National Arboretum, those are black locusts from the lower Hudson Valley of New York. At the Betsy Williams sycamore in Roger Williams Park, the great Roger Williams Park by HWS Cleveland in Providence. There's a like 60-foot long sycamore branch that was hugging the ground. We put a couple props there. Those were also black locust harvested there. We also installed about 18 at one of the probably 5 oldest Katsura trees in the US along our street in Barton Oaks out in the front lawn. Those were orchard poles from a farm supply store in Northern Virginia. So we also need to cultivate a plantation so we can grow the preferred Hiba arborvitae to do this. But for now, they're not too tall. The orchard poles work really well, although they tend to be red pine. Black locusts are really hard to work with. So we're testing. Was that both of your questions? Okay.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Cleo, first year student. And Catherine's question actually made me think of like, how do you consider the ecological communities of trees when you're deciding to plant one tree or a row of trees? You know, pests can infest a row of trees, but also trees are more resilient when they're with others of the same
Yes.
species.
Well, one way is what happens at the Miller Garden. The honey locust alley, the famous one that we all know, it's been replanted 3 times. Like if one dies or if they're having trouble, they take them all out, match, bring all of them back in. Okay, you can do that. The same thing has happened with the horse chestnuts. They were all replaced with Ohio Buckeyes. So, you know, that's obviously one method. If you remember the photograph from Ann Spurn with the sycamores, yeah, you get a gap. You know, you could plant a new little tree there. It becomes complicated. One of the row models that I haven't shown is the row doesn't have to be equally spaced. So you can kind of do 10 and 15 and 12 and 20 and 15 and 12 and 20. And then when something dies, you've got kind of a space to move something else. And so it's an active line over time. That avoids the equal space condition, but that equal space condition is a spatial order that some of us like a lot. In some ways, I don't know that it's any worse than losing the same trees in the forest, because they're still such disruptive absences. In the forest, they're a little disguised unless you know how to read the landscape, and then you're realizing that something is really wrong with some of the species, and then the forest dynamic is going to change. At the Gardner Museum, we use 2, right? We use the Styrax and the Amelanchier, single stem, multi-stem, but similar kind of characteristics. At the IIT campus, which just became an arboretum, we just got a $2 million grant to turn it into an arboretum. This was an initiative by the landscape architecture students, by the way, and we became accredited as an arboretum. We have 68 species, but the dominant character of the campus is pinnate, or if you're in the north, pinnate, leaves with yellow fall foliage, honey locust largely at the canopy. That's been augmented with Kentucky coffee tree, black walnuts, hickories. The ashes were there. They're obviously in severe decline, but there's a preponderance of pinnate yellow fall foliage leaves. And that is a diversification of the primary plant species that the landscape architect Alfred Caldwell had initially set up for the campus. They're kind of picturesque habits, gnarly often, in contrast to the steel and glass cubic volumes of the Mies buildings on the campus. So that's a pretty good example of how we've been working to diversify our campus canopy, but doing it so that the spatial and material characteristics and kind of textural characteristics are fairly similar to what the original intention was. Sean.
Sean, I'm going to have you wrap it up. You're going to last question, and then we're going to break.
My classmate, Sean.
So the fact that we're talking about trees at Penn alone is a fantastic thing. But my question for you is, we tend to design within the palette of the industry that supplies a lot of the trees. And through your research and studies, is there a particular tree that you wish was much more available? I mean, obviously, geographically, that's an influence. But I mean, just thinking in the Northeast, there are so many trees available to us, and yet we're so limited in the palette. I mean, what's your thoughts about that? And I guess the second part of that is, what is your next species infatuation?
We looked all over for those 15 mussel woods for the spring park in Newport. All over. They're coming from Buffalo. We're also looking right now for the straight species, Gleditsia triacanthos, thorns and pods, because the nurseries don't produce them. So there's a few places that we're finding that like accidentally let some of them into the rows, and so they're still there. So those two, that's recent memory. A current obsession. Yes. There's the, it's probably now the black pine. And it's been, something I've drawn, but I think, again, revisiting that grove in front of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, that's the one I'm going to, like the next sketchbook I'm going to pick up, and I'm going to draw some more of those. So by obsession means maybe that's the next one I'm going to draw. Maybe that's the right answer.
Ron, thank you very much.